For my grandmother, her very idea of leaving home was predicated on the idea of going to holy places.
That's writer and New York Times contributor Aatish Taseer, describing what for many in India is a normal part of life.
In India, the word yatri, which means tourist, traveler, is the same word as pilgrim. And so there almost isn't even a division yet between the idea of travel in the tourist sense, in the modern sense, and the idea of pilgrimage.
In the U.S., travelers tend to go to beaches, museums. But even here, the idea of pilgrimage isn't entirely alien.
It was a great surprise for me because I'm married to somebody from the American South here in Tennessee. And his grandmother, who's literally, I don't think has ever left the South, the only time she went anywhere was to go to the Holy Land. And so it was very strange for me to have on one hand the example of traditional India and on the other this highly industrialized modern society. And yet in it was somebody whose basic idea of travel was related to visiting a holy place, going on pilgrimage.
If we look back into history, people have been making pilgrimages for about as long as we can see. It was one of the original reasons for travel. And since this was long before the age of planes, trains, and automobiles, it was also a pretty big commitment. Unlike vacations of leisure today, pilgrimages don't just expand your vistas. They're also meant to heal your soul. But what exactly makes a trip a pilgrimage? How can going on one change you? And what happens after you return? On today's episode, we'll explore these questions with Aatish Taseer, who in 2023 became a pilgrim himself by going on 3 very different religious journeys to Bolivia, Mongolia, and Iraq.
I think that the design of pilgrimage is that it's a kind of large tent and it can include many kinds of people with meaner motives as well as exalted motives. And then there's this sort of bigger transformation that's happening to you almost unbeknownst to you.
And we'll speak with psychologist Heather Warfield, a leading scholar of pilgrimage studies, about how going on these journeys can help expand our minds and heal our psychological wounds.
On pilgrimage journeys, basic needs are often fulfilled, and I think that gives people the opportunity to engage in higher level thinking about who they are and what they want to do in the world.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. Aatish Taseer grew up in India, and even though he wasn't really raised religious, he was surrounded by a huge variety of religious influences from early on. His mother was from a Sikh family, but his father, from whom he was estranged for much of his life, was Pakistani and a Muslim. Add to this that he attended a Christian boarding school in a Hindu-majority country that's also the birthplace of Buddhism. Well, he was bound to pay attention to religion, wasn't he?
It felt very much like one was changing grammar religiously all the time. And for sure inculcated a certain level on which religion operates. It's, that feeling if you hear the azan or that feeling if you hear bells in a town. For me, the idea of a sort of temple town curled around a river in India, of people coming down and chanting and saying their prayers of incense rising, like those things do go through me. I mean, as I'm talking to you right now, I just got a little bit like my hair standing on end. And so I think that religion does operate on that very, very deep level.
So for our listeners, I would hazard to guess most of whom have not been on pilgrimages. Can you give us an example?
So if I may, I'm going to do it like a kind of diptych. There was the Andes. These are the mountains that have inspired worship for 25 centuries in the people of the Altiplano, which is this incredibly high sort of area of tableland that runs between Bolivia and Chile and Peru. And it's at about almost 13,000 feet. And there's this sacred lake called Lake Titicaca, which a lot of origin stories are centered around. And these people who've come from all over the area of the Altiplano and beyond to sort of honor the Virgin of Copacabana. And people originally would come to this place on their knees sometimes. They would walk on their knees. That idea of hardship sort of bringing them nearer the faith, the idea of mortifying the flesh. And it, of course, devolves into fiesta. There's a lot of like drinking in the streets and celebration and merriment. Now, contrast that with sort of Najaf, Iraq. It's 120 degrees, and we're commemorating this martyr of the Shia religion, Hussein, and the Battle of Karbala, where he was slain, and he's a kind of Christ-like figure within Islam, somebody who sort of sacrificed himself so that the true faith could be restored. And the Shia enter into a kind of outpouring. It's a sort of festival of suffering and sorrow. And they do these things to themselves, which are incredibly shocking to see for the first time. You arrive, it's night, the entire city's in black, and on every corner they're sharpening knives. And there's going to be this sort of bloodletting on the final day. And they're cutting their heads. And there's bringing these mashals, which are kind of big iron chandeliers of fire, performing these acts of mortification. Little children are involved. It's a spectacle of faith, very medieval in some ways, and kind of arresting, but at the same time extremely, one is deeply unnerved. So these are kind of two images that kept kind of flashing within my mind as I was trying to balance this whole journey over a course of a year. And it's sort of speaking to the idea that this is not some kind of light undertaking. It really does have this incredibly, it's not just intense in itself, but the creations for further intensification and for further sort of rapture.
It's that powerful, emotional experience that gives pilgrimage its larger-than-life feeling. It doesn't have to come from self-inflicted pain, though. It can come from witnessing beauty, too. But one thing that unites all types of pilgrimages is the idea of traveling to a sacred or revered place.
I think the sacred destination aspect is very interesting, and I think that it is linked to the earth religions, to the veneration of places of power, of energy, of geographical magnificence. Whether it's the sort of bend in a river or it's the sort of high Andes and this holy lake. I do think that the earth religions came up with the idea of venerating these places, because in a lot of cases, Christianity and Islam have adopted or repurposed the holiness and sanctity of these older places.
Okay, but what about that old cliche, it's not the destination, it's the journey? Well, there might be some truth to that too.
I describe that destination as being almost like a decoy. Of course one is going towards it. Of course one must go into the sanctum sanctorum. One must go to the Kaaba. You must go to these places. But what happens if you don't go? Or what happens if something puts you off course? And I remember once being in Spain where I think it was a pilgrimage called a Rosia, which was happening. It was a pilgrimage of southern Spain. And for some reason related to COVID or related to heat, nobody was able to complete it properly. And yet I saw these stragglers arriving, and they were totally elated because they had set out, they'd sort of put their intention into doing this thing. And even if they hadn't been able to achieve their aims, they had been kind of transformed by the journey.
According to anthropologists Victor and Edith Turner, who were some of the world's leading scholars of pilgrimage, that idea of transformation is at the heart of the trek. For them, pilgrimage was a kind of external mysticism. You aren't sitting alone in deep contemplation or downing a psychedelic mushroom to give you a new perspective on things. It's the journey through the outside world that helps you get to somewhere new inside.
completely separates us from tourism. And tourism is full of disappointment because you have these expectations. You have this place where you're going to go and the drink is going to be so cold and the people are going to be perfect and the hotel's going to be lovely. And of course, you don't have the tools to deal with that disappointment, but pilgrims often do have the tools to deal with that kind of religious disappointment, as it were.
What do you mean by the tools to deal with that?
Well, in the sense that our modern idea of travel is completely predicated on getting what we want, whereas there is an inbuilt idea of selflessness or sacrifice in pilgrimage. There is the idea of a kind of inner journey, as it were. So those are resources, and those are things that insulate you if you don't get what you want or if the pilgrimage is not everything you hoped it would be. But of course, there's nothing insulating the modern traveler.
I'm sure there are many and varied reasons that people choose to go on pilgrimages. But if you had to describe broad buckets, what might you say?
So right at the top, I would say like material want. And I don't want to say that in a dismissive way because I think it's very moving when you think about like people thinking, if only I could get to such and such place, that would be great and life would have a certain stability. And those things for me as a writer on a human level were very powerful. In Bolivia, for instance, at the Hill of the Calvary, all these wants had been distilled into little toy replicas. You could get 5 kinds of houses. You could get degrees, PhDs, masters. Some people had just crude cash or they had like cars. And to me, that's an easy thing to laugh at. But as we were coming down from the hill, we saw this young couple and they were with their father and they were using actually a pre-Christian religious figure called an amauta to perform a ceremony because the religion of the Andes is very syncretic. And they were crying because they wanted this thing so badly. And of course, they had faith in their heart, but faith was coalescing with the reality of their lives. And so I would say want is certainly one. Gratitude. This young woman with kind of orange eyeshadow and white tights who would come with her little son who'd been injured and had fallen, and she was thanking the Virgin for having made him okay. Or there'd be older pilgrims who remembered coming with their parents and they were coming to commemorate. And so you're in a sense giving thanks for their lives, but you're also giving thanks for the fact that they introduced you to this rite. And I think for sure, like an ethnic, religious sense of, I wouldn't say chauvinism is too strong a word, but certainly pride and assertion that here we are all as Muslims before God, or here we are all as proud Christians. It creates this passion pilgrimage, but it is based on distinguishing yourselves from those who are not on the pilgrimage or those who are not your co-religionists.
I want to go back to the idea of want, given that that is a motivating factor for a fair number of people. What happens when people go on the pilgrimage and what they wanted doesn't materialize? Do they tend to think that they've done something wrong, or they have to do it again, or do they look back on it with regret?
That's a very interesting question. I'll tell you why, because I think that in some ways it's also linked with the idea that sometimes people will tell you that the thing that you wanted most badly in the world, it was when you relinquished that kind of need to have it then, or you tied your selfhood with it and you'd almost been kind of denied it because you needed to regain your center separate from that thing that you really wanted. And I think that when you come with want in your heart to pilgrimage, but there's also this other religious aspect, it does create a philosophical distance between you and your want. Of course, it's wonderful if you go back and it's granted. But if it's not granted, it also, I think, can create this space where you're able to consider why your sense of self has got so tied up with the attainment of this thing. And I think that it can in some ways be a reckoning with that sort of materiality. It sort of brings you face to face with what are the things you need most. And sometimes I think probably people do go away with human lessons thinking, actually, it was so nice to be with my father that day, even though I didn't get that red car that I wanted. Coming back to reward, coming back to motive. I think that these things can sometimes be misleading because things happen to you over the course of a pilgrimage that you can't necessarily put your finger on. These transformations occur. And I think that the design of pilgrimage is that it's a kind of large tent, and it can include many kinds of people with meaner motives as well as exalted motives. And then there's this sort of bigger transformation that's happening to you almost unbeknownst to you.
Transformation. We hear that word a lot in religion, and with good reason. Many of the challenges we face in life require us to change, to accept a loss, to embrace a new role, or to start over in some other way. But psychologically speaking, that's often a difficult thing to do. If your day-to-day stays the same, it can be hard to change your outlook or reinvent yourself. To do that successfully, it helps to step out of your normal life by stepping into what Victor Turner called a liminal space, a kind of existential no man's land where your usual identity and daily rhythms fall away so that they can more easily be rebuilt in a different form. We often see this in rites of passage, rituals where teenagers shed the role of child and step into adulthood. There's usually some series of hardships or challenges they have to face. They often have to go off into the forest alone or wear different clothes. The whole idea is to snap them out of their current sense of themselves. Might pilgrimages be doing the same thing?
Do you know, people every morning, they get on the subway, they get their coffee, they meet the same people, they come home to their kids at night or their family or their dog or whatever. And I wouldn't want to say the tyranny of habit, but certainly the construct of it is a very powerful thing. And to sort of remove people from that, to remove a huge amount of people from that, to at the same time instill this religious motive in their heart, who knows what can happen.
But there's more to pilgrimage than just being removed from your daily routines and responsibilities. Quite often, parts of the pilgrimage itself, what people actually do, eat, and drink, can alter their mental states. It loosens things up so that a change in perspective is easier.
Bolivia at Fiesta, it devolved into this massive party, and you have these figures, these cholitas, you must have seen them. They sort of wear a mantilla and they have the bowler hat. I would see them rocking with massive bottles of beer, and they were sort of indestructible, but like the men were kind of flailing around, hanging on each other with sort of mouth open, and it got like very drunken and very riotous. It does have the element of what the Russian scholar Shklovsky would call astranenie, of making it strange, of this cast of carnival, of like weirdness, of losing the people you're with, of a feeling of menace and of danger. 100% that sense was there. And in Najaf, even more so, though there wasn't a drop of alcohol consumed, these people were in states of incredible rapture. The heat, the blood, the sort of pure adrenaline of cutting your head, of being in this massive group of people doing it, and this element of theater. The theater was very, very powerful because it was a kind of street theater. And so you were, on one hand, a participant in the sacrifice of Hussein circa 680, and you were in the present mourning Hussein and how you couldn't help him then. And it created this kind of split reality, dealing with your helplessness and sort of wallowing in the fact that you couldn't save this man who was doing so much for you. So the emotions produced by this were just almost narcotic in their own right. Why is it there? I think it's there to enter deeper realms of feeling. I think that habit is such a fortress, and it creates this sort of cushion, or it insulates us from all the more powerful emotions that we have. And the objective of pilgrimage is to create this kind of world in which those protections are scraped away, and elements of uncomfortable emotions, of danger, of ecstasy, all of those things, we're meant to feel those things.
So for the people who do this, whether they're walking extended miles, doing it oftentimes stopping to kneel and prostrate themselves, whether they're engaged in instances of bloodletting or things that can cause pain, why do you think having that hardship is important?
I think this fundamental notion of addressing the problem of the body. I think that that is central to this undertaking of pilgrimage. The flesh is a barrier. We understand that the flesh is a barrier. I'm going to use the Hindu tradition here because I think it's a very sophisticated tradition. In some ways, there is, of course, this element of a mortification of the flesh. And you'll see if you go to the Kumbh Mela in India, which is another major pilgrimage site, I think it's the largest gathering of humanity for a single purpose. And it occurs every 12 years on the banks of this river. And something like 30 million people show up. And that you'll see people with tridents through their cheeks. You'll see them hanging bricks from their penis. There'll be like one person hasn't put his arm down in 14 years. So you'll have these kind of ways in which people have accepted that the body is a barrier for the spirit to speak.
As Aatish said, the body can be a barrier to the spiritual. But it's in overcoming that barrier, in pushing it beyond its normal limits, that the body can become a tool for opening the mind.
I grew up in a very rural community in Wyoming. There were 500 people in my town. I graduated in a class of 26.
Like many rural communities, the one Heather Warfield grew up in was pretty self-contained.
And there was always a sense that there was something bigger and better and greater out in the world.
And Heather wanted to see it. She found it years later on a research trip to Israel.
And I read a book by Bernard Lewis, and he talks about the importance of pilgrimage in all Middle East cultures. And something just clicked for me, that this word was something I had really been unfamiliar with up to this point, and realized, wait, there's something happening here. Millions of people are going to these holy sites, and there are Jewish pilgrims and Christian pilgrims and Muslim pilgrims and Baha'i pilgrims in the north in Haifa. But also there are pilgrims that are visiting battlefields like Latrun and Masada. And so it was very interesting to me to see all of these different types of pilgrims converging in the same geographical location, but seeing the sites very differently. One site that may evoke strong emotion and tears for a Christian woman is not evoking any sense of emotion for someone outside of that context. And so that was very curious to me. So I also started thinking about not only the vast phenomena of pilgrimage experiences that exist historically and right up to the present, but what are people getting out of it? Why are they engaged in this? And why, for millennia, do people go out away from their homes on these types of journeys?
Psychologically speaking, what makes something a pilgrimage? I mean, I think I and many of our listeners have been on road trips where we might want to go to see a city, or we might want to go, I lived in the Midwest for a long time, and so we might want to go see the big ball of string or the Paul Bunyan statue that is there on a road trip. What makes a trip a pilgrimage rather than just a trip?
I think there has to be a heightened quest for meaning. The meaning part of the motivation becomes central to the travel. And sometimes that doesn't occur as an intention before the trip. This can happen after the trip when people are making meaning about their travel and they realize that something they may not have had an awareness of at the time was actually a pilgrimage for them.
What exactly do you mean by meaning making?
I think pilgrims are constructing significance and understanding about their individual lives in the world. And a pilgrimage gives oftentimes time and space. Many of these pilgrimages are weeks long. But even in the case of a pilgrimage that's one day, the pilgrimage is a way of sort of connecting maybe fragmented points into sort of one cohesive and integrated whole.
What do we know as researchers about how pilgrimages change people?
So the biggest area, I think, is around meaning making. There have been a number of studies that have looked at meaning making and meaning construction and looking at the long-term impact. And so we know that pilgrimages increase meaning making. We also know that they increase self-reported sense of belongingness. And psychological well-being is reported as quite high after a pilgrimage.
So is it fair to say that not all, but a good number of pilgrims go on the journey because they are trying to understand or to make meaning or to incorporate some issue in their lives? And if that's the case, it strikes me that that could also have a therapeutic element too. Is that true?
Absolutely. People have this increased connection to God or a divine energy. They connect to other people, and they also report being more connected to themselves. So the connection piece is, I think, integral to the therapeutic outcome of a pilgrimage. In much of my work, I've also looked at how on pilgrimage journeys, oftentimes the very basic needs are taken care of. So there are pilgrim hostels, there are meals that are a part of this. And I think that gives people the opportunity to engage in higher level thinking about who they are and what they want to do in the world and how they relate to other people.
The Camino de Santiago de Compostela, or the Way of St. James as it's known in English, is one of the most famous pilgrim routes in the world. Well, actually, it's more than one route, as there are several different paths to follow. But they all end at the same place, the shrine of the Apostle James in northwestern Spain. Pilgrims began walking these paths in the 9th century, but many people are still following in their footsteps today. In fact, both the numbers and the reasons for going have been increasing since the 1970s.
The majority of people, at least in 2023, were walking for either non-religious reasons or partially religious reasons.
So when you say non-religious reasons, oftentimes we hear nowadays about the growing segment of the populace who identify as being spiritual but not religious. That is, they don't affiliate with any of the major institutional faiths, but yet they are looking for some type of connection to something beyond themselves. Is that the people who are going for non-religious reasons, or are people going for just completely secular reasons?
I think both. Many people are going for what we would consider as sort of health and well-being reasons. Some are wanting to exercise for days or weeks or months in a prolonged manner. Some are going to consider a change of career, for example, or a relationship has ended and they want to process that. They want to see France and Spain. I mean, who doesn't want to do that? So this is also a motivator. People want to see the geography and the history and the landscape. There is another segment of the population that wants to connect with God or a divine energy, and they want to define it on their own terms. So that is also part of this. There are others who are going as therapy. The Netherlands, for example, the national healthcare system will fund pilgrimages as part of therapy and as part of healing. And so that is also part of this.
When it comes to mental health, I talk a lot about what we can learn from religion. And this is a great example. The fact that a national healthcare system not only recognizes the healing power of pilgrimage, but is also funding people to go on them is amazing. And Heather's research suggests that pilgrimages don't have to be religiously inspired to be effective.
After the end of World War I, pilgrimages were widely undertaken. This was something I did not know until the last couple of years, and it has really had a profound impact on how I view these from a psychological standpoint. So many veterans were traveling back to France. They had been in the war and returned to really all over the world. And then groups of veterans started coming back in the 1920s and 1930s. They were coming back together. They were oftentimes coming back with people from the same unit, and in many cases, it was the same location. And they would go to battlefields. They would go to cemeteries, and many of them either kept journals or there were books written after the event where the veterans talked about how important it was to go back to see that their sacrifice meant something. So a key part of these pilgrimages was interacting with French people. And oftentimes the veterans talked about how happy the children were, and that was really impactful for them. It helped them see that the experiences that they had in a combat situation were not futile, that they were for a reason. So this was really a type of group therapy. I also think that these pilgrimage sites that may be important for World War I are also important for people who are currently serving. It's quite profound when someone realizes that their experience is not isolated and it is not only happening right now, that other veterans of past wars also experienced shell shock or battle fatigue. The veterans that I have spoken to, or active duty personnel that I've spoken to at these sites, they feel at home amongst this community, even though a century has passed.
What do you think that psychologists and therapists could learn from this?
I think one lesson is that counseling and therapeutic processes are not restricted to a counseling office. That the role of the counselor or therapist in this situation is that of a sort of a facilitator to help people process pilgrimage experiences. There's some interesting research from movement therapy that looks at how people are when they are side by side and walking or moving together, and how people report they're more vulnerable and open for self-disclosure when they are side by side versus face to face. In terms of healing specific to combat veterans, I think it's important to acknowledge that very often veterans are more comfortable and more vulnerable with each other. And sitting in a talk therapy setting may not be effective for combat veterans or other members of the population, not just combat veterans. So I think this idea that therapeutic processes can happen outdoors or out of an office is important.
So Heather, I know you've mentioned that when people return from pilgrimages, there tends to be an uptick in their sense of well-being. But I'm wondering, does that endure, or are there other long-lasting changes, either in terms of the way they view the world or their psychological well-being?
For many people, becoming a part of a social media community like a Facebook group that is specifically focused on the pilgrimage happens after they return. So the sense of community and belongingness based on the status of a pilgrim does remain, oftentimes for decades after the pilgrimage. I've heard from many pilgrims that their own spiritual practices deepened during a pilgrimage and they continue on after they return home. I definitely think that people are more primed for experiences of awe and looking for situations of connection and serendipity once they come back. I think that pilgrims also see other pilgrims in a way that is different. For example, a Camino pilgrim may have a different appreciation for an Islamic woman who is doing the Hajj, an Aussie who is walking the Kokoda track, or a U.S. Marine visiting Belleau Wood. So I do think that there is an increased tolerance that pilgrims return with, that they see that these experiences connect us, that we are all human, and that we're all questing for some type of importance and transformation and meaning. And I do think that the pilgrimages do lead to a greater level of tolerance.
When it comes to capturing the power of pilgrimage, I think Rebecca Solnit might have said it best. In her book Wanderlust, A History of Walking, she writes, "Pilgrimages make it possible to move physically, through the exertions of one's body, step by step, toward those intangible spiritual goals that are otherwise so hard to grasp." Growing spiritually and healing psychologically are both journeys of a sort, ones that require personal effort and struggle, but also benefit immensely from guidance along the way. And to me, that's what pilgrimages do. Yes, they're a trip, but they've been honed by history to shepherd us through natural beauty, sacred architecture, and rituals of emotional power. Maybe it's like Victor and Edith Turner suggested. Occasionally, we need to take our spiritual practice out of our heads and onto the road to find a new perspective.
So there are sky watches. So people go out and you look up. And a lot of times people feel like they're getting signs and wonders from the UFOs or the UAP that they're in contact with.
Looking up to the sky, trying to commune with great beings whose power you don't truly understand, it might seem strange. But in truth, it's what's been going on in religion since the beginning of time.
Religion is the history of beings from the sky coming down and engaging with beings from the ground, which are us.
The revelation of the truth that is going to change everything and create a whole new social order to make everything better and different. And for some people, that savior is extraterrestrial.
But what happens when these alternative spiritualities turn to something darker?
What is a religious belief and what is a conspiracy theory is almost entirely subjectively drawn.
That's next time on How God Works. How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our intern is Annika DeVries. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org, or follow me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.